Hi. So we are now concluding Unit 1, which is the Introduction to International Trade. I'm your host, Elias. Now, in this concluding video, I want us to look at the partial and the general equilibrium analysis, and then the determination of the terms of trade. So let's begin by looking at the partial equilibrium. So in determining the relative commodity price, let's first consider nation 1. So we have commodity X, which is the commodity of nation 1's comparative advantage, and therefore it means that nation 1 is specializing in producing X and therefore supply X to nation 2. Now, if we look at this panel, nation 1 is in equilibrium at the price P1 at point A. Now, at this point, this is the autarky point where what is produced in nation 1 is consumed within the nation. And so, we see that at the price P1, nation 1 is in autarky at point A. The line, the black line, which is dropping or which is moving downwards is the demand curve, and the upward sloping line is the supply curve for commodity X in nation 1. Now, if you recall from our previous graphs, that at the autarky price in nation 1, the relative commodity price was 1/4. If we make that assumption, then it means that for the nation to be able to produce more and export, the domestic price should be gravitating towards the international price, and therefore the price will be going up towards P2. Now, what we should note here is that for any price that will be above P1, nation 1, the domestic market in nation 1 will not be in equilibrium, because according to the law of demand and supply, for demand, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. And therefore, if the price will be going up from P1, it means that the quantity demanded will be reducing at each conceivable price. Whereas the supply side, for a higher price, the quantity supplied increases, because to the producer, a higher price is a motive and a direction to profit maximization. And therefore, if the price is going up, the producers will supply more on the market, and this will lead to excess supply in on the domestic market, or simply there will be a surplus on the domestic market for commodity X. Now, what will nation 1 do with the excess supply? Well, nation 1 will have to export the excess to the other nation, which is nation 2. And therefore, because it has produced more, all the excess will be exported, and then whatever remains will be consumed locally. Now, let's also look at nation 2 and see what is happening. So with nation 2, we see that nation 2 is also in equilibrium at point A prime, where the demand for commodity X is equal to the supply for commodity X at A prime. Now, we noted that when nation 1 is in equilibrium at a price P1, the reciprocal will be the domestic terms of trade for the other nation, or the domestic relative commodity prices for the other nation. So which means that for nation 1, which has a lower price of commodity X at A, nation 2 will have a price P3, and it will be in autarky at A prime. And recall that nation 2 has a comparative disadvantage in the production of commodity X. Therefore, nation 2 will specialize in producing commodity Y, and after exchange, nation 2 will import X from nation 1. Therefore, we see that for any price that is below P3, which is the equilibrium price, there will be a shortage on the market for commodity X in nation 2. And therefore, because the nation, what we see here is that the nation has not completely specialized in producing Y, but it has continued producing X. Therefore, at this point, we note that for nation 2, as the more the price is reducing, the higher the shortage, or the higher the gap between what is demanded and what is supplied on the domestic market. And this leads to a shortage. Now, if we analyze the demand and supply for commodity X in nation 2 and move to the demand and supply for commodity X in nation 1, we can then determine our international terms of trade, or the equilibrium relative commodity price, by joining these points. So we see that when nation 1 is in autarky at point A, remember that everything produced is consumed domestically, and therefore supply will be 0 on the international market at P1, and this gives rise to the point here, the intercept on the relative commodity price axis. So we see that at P1, supply on the international market is 0. And the more the price increases in nation 1, we will be seeing a surplus on the domestic market. And therefore, this surplus gives rise to the amounts or the volumes of trade that will have to be exported to nation 2. And therefore, this gives rise to the supply curve of commodity X on the international market. And then when we reach P2, we note that the whole of this gap, which is the surplus, will be exported. And therefore, the distance between point B and E is equal to the distance between B prime and E prime. I mean B star and E star. Because the gap here, which is the surplus, as we move up, the gap will be widening, and therefore this will give rise to the amounts that nation 1 will supply on the international market. Now, recall that in a two nations model, what is exported by one nation is equal to the imports of the other nation. This means that at the price P2, which is the international terms of trade or relative commodity price, nation 2 will import the amount that is excess in nation 1. And therefore, this tells us that the distance between B and E is equal to the distance between B prime and E prime, which is the import in nation 2. So when the price goes up beyond P2, we notice that nation 1 producers in nation 1 will be supplying more and more volumes on the international market. But however, there will be a surplus even on the international market, because nation 2 will not be willing to buy commodities at a higher price above the international relative commodity price. Therefore, the only price where both the import and export, or demand and supply, will be equal on the international market is at the price P2. Okay, so now let's look at trade based on different tests. Now, where we are coming from, we've assumed that we are dealing with the eco test, and therefore we noted that different nations can be on the same indifference curve, or community indifference curve. But if we have different tests, consider nation 1, which is in autarky at point A on indifference curve I, or 1, and nation 2, which is in autarky at A prime on indifference curve 1 prime. And therefore we know that at this point, the relative commodity price in nation 1 is lower than the relative commodity price in nation 2. And this means that nation 1 then has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X, and therefore it will specialize in producing X by moving down the curve all the way to point B, where the international relative commodity prices are equal for all trading nations. In the same way, we can see that nation 2 has a steeper slope, which means that the relative commodity price is higher in nation 2, and therefore nation 2 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X. And this means that nation 2 will move up the production frontier all the way to point B prime, where it meets the international relative commodity price. And at point B or B prime, the terms of trade in nation 1 equal the terms of trade in nation 2. So at this point, then it means that nation 1 will export 60X and import 60Y and consume at point E. Whereas nation 2 will export 60Y and import 60X and consume at point E prime. So you will notice that the trading possibility line here is the same, and therefore all indifference curves lying on this line have the equal relative commodity prices, but the tests are different. Okay, let's now turn our focus to the offer curves. Now, offer curves are also known as the reciprocal demand curves, because what we see is that what one nation supplies gives us the import of the other nation, and therefore the offer curve of a nation shows how much of its import commodity the nation demands for it to be willing to supply various amounts of its export commodity. In the case of nation 1, which has a comparative advantage in producing X and a comparative disadvantage in producing Y, the offer curve of nation 1 will show us how many units of commodity Y nation 1 will be willing to import for it to be willing to export different amounts of commodity X to the other nation. Simply put, the offer curve of a nation shows the nation's willingness to import and export at various relative commodity prices. Now, in simple analysis, thus offer curves incorporate both the element of demand and supply, because the nation will have to see how many units it can import and how many units it can export to other nations. And therefore, by importing, we are looking at the demand side of the international demand side, and by exporting, we are looking at the supply side of the market. To construct offer curves, therefore, we need three things. Number one is that the nation's production frontier must be defined, and we also need the indifference map for a given nation. So from given the production frontier, then the nation will have to choose, or rather locate itself on a higher indifference curve given the indifference map. So remember that an indifference map is a group of indifference curves. So there are a lot of community indifference curves. Okay, whereas an indifference curve is just one curve that we're looking at. And finally, we need various hypothetical relative commodity prices at which trade could take place. Otherwise, without these relative commodity prices, we will not be able to define the direction of a trade. So for a nation which has a relatively lower commodity price, will have a comparative advantage in producing a given commodity, and therefore it will tell us how many units it will be able to export for it to reach the international terms of trade. Okay, so now let's look at the derivation of the offer curve. Let's consider nation 1, which is in autarky at point A. Now, at point A, recall that nation 1 has the slope of 1/4, which is a quarter. So at point A, the relative commodity price is 1/4, which means that nation 1 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X. And therefore, Nation 1 will have to specialize in producing X. By moving down the curve, it will increase the production volumes. And when it reaches point B, Nation 1 will meet the international terms of trade. And that at that point, Nation 1 will export 60 units of X and import 60 units of Y to consume at point E. Now, suppose that Nation 1 did not go all the way to point B, but instead moved all the way to point F, where the terms of trade, the relative commodity prices in Nation 1 is still lower than the international relative commodity price. And at this point, if Nation 1 decides to trade, then it will export some units. So it will export 40 units of X and import 20 units of Y. And by so doing, then Nation 1 will consume at point H, which is a lower indifference curve, because Nation 1 still has the capacity to expand production and therefore export more volumes and import more volumes, and therefore it will be able to consume on a higher indifference curve. Now, let's look at how this illustration here affects the shape of the offer curve. Now, consider on the right panel here, where we have the offer curve. When the nation is in autarky at point A, that means at point A, Nation 1 is exporting 0 units of commodity X. And therefore, we see that Nation 1 then will be at the corner here when it's in autarky. That's 0 import, 0 export. Now, if Nation 1 specializes in producing commodity X and moves all the way to point B, we note that the relative commodity price will become 1. And so if we draw a line from the origin straight with the ray of 1, we see that we are spotting our relative commodity price, which is for international, at point E, where Nation 1 is exporting 60 units of X and importing 60 units of Y. And if Nation 1 decides to specialize partially up to point F, and the relative commodity price is half, then it means we will have this line here with the ray of 1, the slope of 1, which we are plotting and then showing that the relative commodity price is half. And therefore, we note that if we join these 2 points, then we will have the offer curve for Nation 1. Now, recall that the domestic relative commodity price for Nation 1 is the reciprocal of the domestic relative commodity price for Nation 2. Therefore, it means that on the other side of the line passing through the middle, which is equal to 1, it means that on the other side here, we have the offer curve for Nation 2. And we can draw these lines to show that Nation 2 will cancel. We will have this ray, which will have the line of 2, which will be 2, and this one 4 here will pass somewhere here. So we can have the 4 there. And if we join these lines with a smooth curve, we will have the offer curve for Nation 2 passing like that. So I've left the offer curve for Nation 2 in your slides, and for this analysis I have removed it because it's something that you can check out and then compare with what I've presented here so that you understand it more. Okay. So now let's look at the general equilibrium analysis. So this is the offer curve that we drew. So we have one for Nation 1 and then the offer curve for Nation 2, which is showing the willingness for a nation to import some units for it to be able to export, or for it to be willing to export certain amounts of the commodity of its comparative advantage. So we noted that when the nation is when Nation 1 is at the relative commodity price of half, it will be exporting 40 units of X and importing 20 units of Y. At the international terms of trade or international relative commodity price, Nation 1 will export 60 units of X and import 60 units of Y to have the equilibrium point E. In nation 2, when nation 1 exports 40 units of X, it means nation 2 imports 40 units of X. So the export of one nation equals the import of the other nation. And if nation 1 exports 60 units of X, it means nation 2 imports 60 units of X. And therefore, if we draw this line, it means we are going to be on this point here, which is point E prime. Okay, so now let's look at this in more detail. So the line passing in the middle is the international relative commodity price, and the two offer curves are meeting at this point, defining the equilibrium relative commodity price, which is equal to 1 in this case. Okay, so now let's look at the general versus partial equilibrium. And basically, we will just present the partial equilibrium here and see how the relative commodity price affect the demand and supply on the international market. Now, you will notice that the market, the international market, is in equilibrium at point E, where 60 units of X are exported by nation 1 and 60 units of X are imported by nation 2. Therefore, at any price below the international relative commodity price, let's say at half, it means that at this point then, nation 1 will be less willing to supply a lot of commodities. So nation 1 will only supply 40 units. But nation 2 will be willing to import as many units as possible, all the way to 120, because the commodity is cheaper for nation 2 to import. Therefore, this will give rise to excess demand or shortage of commodity X on the international market. And for any price above the international relative commodity price of 1, let's say price of 1.5, we note that nation 1 then will be willing to supply a lot of commodities, a lot of units on the market, and therefore this will give rise to a surplus, because nation 2 will not be willing to buy at a higher price. So the quantity demanded of commodity X will be less, while the quantity supplied will be more, and this will give us the excess supply of commodity X on the international market. So it means that for any price above, there will be a downward pressure towards the international relative commodity price, and for any price below, it will put an upward pressure towards the international relative commodity price of 1. Therefore, the only price at which the exports will equal imports on the international market is the price of 1, which is the international relative commodity price. Let's now look at the terms of trade of the other nations, So we've been looking at the terms of trade in relation to relative commodity prices, but let's define them in more details. So the terms of trade of a nation is the ratio of the price of its export commodity to the price of its import commodity. In the case of nation 1, the terms of trade of nation 1 is the ratio of the price of commodity X to the price of commodity Y. Okay, so we have defined therefore that terms of trade, we look at the commodity of comparative advantage. So in case of nation 1, commodity of comparative advantage is commodity X. And therefore, if we're getting the terms of trade, we put the commodity of comparative advantage on the numerator, because that's the export commodity, and the price of the commodity of comparative disadvantage in the denominator. Therefore, the terms of trade is equal to the ratio of the price of a commodity of comparative advantage to the price of a commodity of comparative disadvantage. Now, in a two nations world, the terms of trade of one nation equals the reciprocal of the terms of trade of the other nation. Meaning that if nation 1's terms of trade is 1/4, it means that nation 2's terms of trade will be 4. And if nation 1's terms of trade is equal to 1 over 2, it means that nation 2's terms of trade will be equal to 2. Therefore, one nation's terms of trade will equal the reciprocal of the other nation's terms of trade. Okay, so now we have denoted this, we've taken note of this example. So now let's look at the general case where we have several units exported and several units imported. Now, in the case of many commodities, suppose that nation 1 was not only exporting commodity X, but exporting many commodities and importing many commodities, then the terms of trade of a nation will be the index of the export price divided by the index of the import prices. And thus, what we'll have is that the terms of trade will be equal to export price index divided by import price index, and then we multiply by 100. It should also be noted that these terms of trade are also known as the commodity terms of trade or the net barter terms of trade. So if you are reading any text and you find the terms of trade being called or termed as a commodity terms of trade or net barter terms of trade, you should understand that we are looking at the export price divided by the import price for any given nation. It should also be noted that in the base year, the terms of trade of a given nation is equal to 100. Let's take a look at this example. Suppose that the terms of trade of nation 1 increased by 130. This would mean that nation 1's export prices rose by 30% in relation to the import price. Because in the base year, the terms of trade of a nation is equal to 100, then if the terms of trade have increased to 130, then the prices of the export commodity will have increased by 30%. Now, if the price of the export commodity has increased by 30%, it means then that the importing nation has received a higher price. It means that whereas nation 1 has exported an expensive item, nation 2 will be importing an expensive item, which means then that the denominator for nation 2, which is the commodity of its comparative disadvantage, the price, will be high. And therefore, if the terms of trade of nation 1 have improved, then the terms of trade of nation 2 will deteriorate. So with this example then, we would see that nation 2's terms of trade would deteriorate from 100 to 77. So 100 is the base year terms of trade, but now we have 130, which has become the import price. So let's do this. So terms of trade in nation 2, okay, will be equal to the price of commodity Y divided by the price of commodity X, and then we multiply this by 100. Now we are putting this up by price. We are going to pick the whole lot of the index. So if nation 1's terms of trade have increased to 130, it means then that we will have 130 in the denominator, because this will be the index for the import price in nation 2. And the export price in nation 2 remains 100. And therefore, if we multiply this by 100, then we will have 77 as the new terms of trade for nation 2. So it means that whereas the terms of trade for nation 1 have increased to 130, the terms of trade for nation 2, as a result of the improvement in nation 1's terms of trade, nation 2's terms of trade will deteriorate to 77. So we should note therefore that, let's make 3 notes, that number 1, even if nation 1's terms of trade improves over time, we cannot conclude that nation 1 is necessarily better off because of the improvement in the terms of trade. In the same way, we cannot say that nation 2 is worse off because of the deterioration in the terms of trade. There are other factors that we need to look at for us to know whether nation 1, the welfare of nation 1 has improved or reduced. So we will look at the tariffs and other factors, some restrictions on trade, and see what really affects the welfare of a nation. Is it really the terms of trade, or there are other barriers, there are other factors that will affect the welfare of a nation? Number two, we note that changes in a nation's terms of trade are the result of many forces at work, both in that nation and the rest of the world. So like in the case of the current situation of the coronavirus, we see that the worsening of a nation's welfare, the welfare of different nations being in the state that it is in, is not only because there are barriers to movements, but there are other factors that we need to consider, such as even barriers of commodity movements, barriers on transportation, the movement bans, and so on. So we should note, therefore, that changes in the nation's terms of trade are not only as a result of the changes in price, but many other forces that will affect trade. So we cannot determine, therefore, the net effect on a nation's welfare by simply looking at the changes in the terms of trade. We need to look at all the factors that will affect trade between or among nations. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, please send an email to muauelias@gmail.com. I'll see you in Unit 2, where we will expand our modern theories and look at other factors that, other theories that influence trade between or among nations. Bye-bye.